Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Davin with Push Pull Grow.
I'm Steve Christopher here with SC Sports Performance.
Today we'd like to talk to you a little bit about caffeine and its role in sports performance and nutrition supplements. So let's start off. Caffeine is what we would consider an adenosine receptor antagonist, meaning it blocks the adenosine receptors and prevents adenosine from binding. Now, adenosine it's a neuromodulator that basically tells your body to slow down. It accumulates throughout the day as a result of intensive thinking, exercise, movement, and essentially kind of brings about the sensation of fatigue. Now, adenosine also plays a role in controlling and regulating heart rate and central nervous system activity. So as you can imagine, when you block the adenosine receptor, prevent it from binding, you have kind of this speeding effect, or this stimulatory effect, I should say. And that's essentially the primary route through which caffeine works.
So now we're going to go into some of the things you should expect when taking something with caffeine in it, such as an energy drink,
Coffee,
pre-workouts,
thermogenics,
fat burners.
right?
So some of the things you can expect when taking caffeine. A fun fact is doctors a lot of times will actually advise, I can't say prescribe, they'll advise that people with ADD start with caffeine as opposed to taking a drug like Adderall. Now, it's a really safe way to do it, and it's been pretty effective. So one of the things that caffeine's been shown to do is increase focus. So that could be a huge benefit when it comes to sports performance, or even you sitting in math class. Another thing to expect is an increase in endurance performance. There are multiple studies, which we'll put a bunch of them in the link in this video, that talk about its increases in athletic performance when it comes to endurance, whether it be extra repetitions of a set or whether it comes to cycling performance in long distances. There's a huge range of benefits there. Going into one of the last ones I'll talk about is an increase in anaerobic power. Now, when it comes to this, that'd be saying like something like a 1 rep max bench press, or a squat go up, or a vertical jump goes up.
Or even a sprint.
A
perhaps.
sprint? Oh, for sure. That's one thing that it's so versatile. It is a drug. We're going to say caffeine's a drug.
Absolutely.
We're going to take that statement, I guess,
Right,
or that
right.
stance. Now, something we're going to go into here is what dosage of caffeine do you need? Okay, so it's completely dependent on your body weight and your tolerance. So the most research right now all support from between 3 milligrams per kilogram and 9 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So now for you, you want to experiment with it, just see where you are. I'd start at the lower zone.
I mean, you could really see benefits even below that, especially if your tolerance is pretty low, and that's going to kind of be contingent upon your overall body weight and just how experienced you are with caffeine. So one of the things that research has also shown is that caffeine has this ability to kind of tap into, well, we kind of talked about the whole energy side of things, or the focus side of things, but it allows you to tap into that for performance. And what I mean by that is you're able to kind of dig a little bit deeper, push a little bit harder. It reduces your perceptions of fatigue during a given exercise or bout of exercise, which in turn allows you to train or perform at a higher level. There was a study that I found actually that showed that when two groups of cyclists were given, well, I guess one group was given caffeine, the other wasn't. Both groups had been subjected to a carbohydrate depleting type of workout, and the group that had received the caffeine was able to perform alongside the control group. So despite the fact that they had been depleted of carbohydrate, they were able to perform at that higher anaerobic level. So that's pretty neat in and of itself.
So another study I wanted to talk about is they did a study on elite level female rugby players. And when I say elite, they were on the international team, and so they're traveling and playing other countries. Anyway, what they did with this study is they gave these female athletes 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight caffeine before their match plays. And they analyzed a bunch of different metrics in this study to measure, and the one metric that went up quite a bit was actually what they called body contacts, which in rugby directly correlates to tackles. Now you could look at that, that's a pretty important statistic.
Yeah, I would say, kind of coming back to that whole focus or that digging deeper concept that I mentioned, that's probably along that same line of effects, right? Because we're able to kind of tap into a deeper, I guess what we would call like an aggression, right, in that sense.
Could be, yeah.
And overall improve your playing performance.
The one thing so some of the other metrics that they were looking at that didn't go up were ones that are more associated with rugby skill, which would be the accuracy of a pass or how well you would do in something called a ruck. All these other stats that they looked at, they wanted to see if the skill went up, and they found that it didn't. So the one thing that went up was body contacts or tackling, but that's not considered a skill, even though it might be something important. And so something they're gonna go do is they're gonna redo studies like this in the future with higher doses, because their theory is that a higher dose of caffeine will actually increase the skill components of sports.
So something else that makes me think of, this is a bit of a tangent, but thinking in terms of like sports psychology, there's a concept of what we call, like, was it alertness or attention, essentially, where a certain zone of attention or alertness or awareness is important, but beyond that, it's arousal. That's what I'm looking for. So arousal. So a certain level of arousal is important. However, beyond a certain threshold, you actually become impaired. You start performing worse. But below a certain threshold, you perform worse. So it seems that caffeine might be able to help us kind of hone in on that
Ideal
mid-ground.
performance state.
Right. But that's where dosing, I guess, comes in making sure that you're getting the proper doses so as to not over
For sure.
arousal.
So going into now some of the darker sides of caffeine, we're going to go into the side effects. Now, probably the most prevalent side effect, or a lot of people realize, is anxiety. Now, that can get tied right in hand with jitters, right? Sometimes you get the little shakes.
Personally, I would say they're probably the same thing, right?
Could.
Jitters, anxiety.
Yeah, you're just like, you're uncomfortable. You're sitting
Right.
there, you're shaking, you're nervous, you're taking in too much stimulus, and you're overthinking. And that's one thing that we consider that dose dependent. You know, the higher you go with your dose, the worse that side effect is probably going to be. So that's why you always want to start at a lower dose and work your way up. Kind of like with any drug, any supplement, you always start at the lower end.
Right. And if you're anxiety prone, chances of experiencing anxiety from stimulants or caffeine are probably higher. So keep that in mind.
Gosh, yeah, it's scary, man.
Can be.
So the next thing we're going to go into, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the heart. So left ventricular hypertrophy, also called athlete's heart, is another big player when it comes to caffeine. So what happens here is your body adapts to a response in increased workload, and how it responds is that the wall of your left ventricle in your heart actually thickens. And now when that heart muscle thickens, the actual chamber within the left ventricle shrinks. So we're going to get into kind of what that really does, but that's a really scary adaptation to have.
Right. Obviously, when we lift weights or exercise, generally the goal in a lot of sense is to build the muscle size, make the biceps big, unlike Steve here. So the thing that's happening with the heart is we're having that same sort of adaptation. The heart is getting bigger, it's getting thicker, which sounds like a good thing, but when you start thinking about hemodynamics and kind of how the fluid, as our blood travels through the cardiovascular system, that's actually bad. We have this, basically this thickening of the heart wall. Also, we have a constricting of the blood vessels, right? More specifically, the arteries. And so we kind of have this decreased room for the fluid that's there. The fluid volume doesn't change. The fluid volume stays the same, but the chamber in which the fluid is contained shrinks. And that results in an increase in pressure. So that's where we see the acute spike in blood pressure from caffeine, and that's very much dose dependent. That also kind of feeds back into the left ventricular hypertrophy, because when you think about the heart pushing blood out, right, from the left ventricle into the cardiovascular system, the arteries, the more resistance there is on that motion or on that pumping, the more that heart has to work, right? And so that's where we see, just like with your biceps, right, or your quads or whatever, when you're subjecting them to resistance, they get bigger, and that's kind of what you see with heart. But again, when we think of adaptations, cardiovascular adaptations, that's not the one we want to see. That's not what makes you a better runner or a better athlete. Typically what you're seeing with aerobic sports or aerobic conditioning is actually an enlarging in terms of
The chamber.
The chamber can get bigger. It can stretch. So it's an elasticity of that chamber rather than a thickening of the walls of that chamber, if that makes sense. And that greater elasticity, that stretching capacity, allows for more blood per beat. And that's why you'll see a decrease in heart rates in really elite level athletes, swimmers, marathon runners, etc. And that's why you typically don't see that as much in people who are more specifically anaerobic in their training, weightlifters, Olympic lifters, power lifters, bodybuilders in some cases. So something to keep in mind is that caffeine can kind of exacerbate those negative side effects.
For sure. So now we covered anxiety, we covered left ventricular hypertrophy, how left ventricular hypertrophy can then lead to an increased heart rate and increased blood pressure. What else do you think they'd have to worry about? We'll cut this pause out.
One last thing, I guess, that we want to reference, this kind of ties back into anxiety, but insomnia or sleeplessness. A lot of people work out in the evenings, right? And they're going to the gym 8, 9 o'clock because it's after school, it's after work, it's after the day is done, and they're usually pretty
It's a
tired.
great idea. They're like, oh, I'm kind of tired. I'm gonna pop some C4 right quick. Let me get 2 scoops.
Right, or caffeine in general. I mean, they who knows? I mean, I know some people. I'm not gonna name any names. Marco.
Turn down for what?
But who will take both a pre-workout and an energy drink to wash it down, and then they end up with these hyper-excited states. Now the problem with that is that caffeine has about a 5-6 hour half-life. Okay, and so that means it takes a while to clear from your system, and so you're going to be stimulated long after you leave the gym. So timing is really, really crucial there too. If you're taking caffeine right before you go into the gym, it's going to take about 30-45 minutes to really start kicking in, taking effect, and then it's going to be active for the next 6 hours, right? So it might not be kicking in until halfway through your workout. So timing is kind of important. Think about that when you're dosing your caffeine. Secondarily, if you're eating a big meal and then taking caffeine, you're delaying that onset, delaying the digestion and absorption. So that's another factor, right? So you eat a big meal, or even a moderate meal. Heck, you eat and then you take some caffeine before the gym, which is pretty common practice,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
You're going to see this kind of delayed onset of caffeine throughout the rest of the evening, which can affect your sleep quality and overall affect your performance the next day, and then kind of leads through this vicious cycle of needing more and more caffeine.
So one more thing we're going to cover, because it completely slipped my mind, I'm sure it slipped Devin's mind as well, is the caffeine headaches. So that's
yeah.
kind of important. And we kind of touched on the adenosine receptors at the start of the video. And he's out of caffeine, he's done for. He can't focus, he's already
done.
he's losing it. At the start of the video though, we talked about those adenosine receptors and how that's basically what makes caffeine work, is the how it basically binds to it and turns that receptor off. That's really what's happening. And the adaptation your body makes to this is when that receptor is blocked, your body's like, hey, I'm going to make more receptors. It's going to make this work. So you make more and more of those receptors, and then what happens is you take away that caffeine. This is where you get your caffeine headaches, right? You take caffeine for weeks and weeks, and then you miss it for a day, like you don't take your pre-workout or you don't drink your coffee in the morning, and you notice you get those horrible headaches. I'll let Davin finish this explanation.
So yeah, kind of following along with that, it's the, like I was talking about, the vasoconstrictive effect. Your body is always striving to achieve homeostasis, right? So when we chronically subject ourselves to elevated levels of adenosine receptor antagonism, or caffeine, the increased level, or the response would be to then produce more adenosine receptors so that the body can bring itself back down to homeostasis or baseline. And that's what we call tolerance. However, when you have this chronic ingestion of caffeine, you have this chronic vasoconstrictive effect. And when you remove caffeine and you have a heightened sensitivity then to adenosine, your body is going to see kind of this super compensation where we have a strong vasodilatory effect, right? And that's where the blood vessels get bigger. And that's typically one of the leading theories behind caffeine-related headaches is we have excessively increased blood flow to the brain.
And how do we not get the caffeine headaches?
Well, I usually use Diet Mountain Dew,
1 can.
or 4, depending. It's all contingent upon your daily caffeine intake, right?
True. Let's say someone drinks like a cup of coffee every day or 2 cups, maybe even 3 cups of coffee every day, and they're stopping their coffee consumption. They might be able to get away with drinking 1 Diet Mountain Dew or 1.5, and then they can bump it down to like half a 1. Or
Yeah, the main lesson there, or I guess principle that we're trying to get across is tapering. Tapering your dosage of caffeine off is probably the best and most tolerable way to discontinue your caffeine use. And for reference, it actually takes about 21 days or so to completely reset your body to non-caffeinated environment. So, and that's not counting your days of tapering off. So keep that in mind if you're taking some time off a pre-workout or a given caffeine supplement or thermogenic, fat burner, whatever it may be, is that it takes you about 3 weeks to go back to normal.
For sure, guys, we're sure some of you guys have questions, whether it be about the research, whether it be about certain, how to put it, adaptations the body has to caffeine or whatnot, or supplements. Be sure to let us know below. We are
Right.
desperately looking for your comments to give us ideas of what we should be doing with our lives.
Right, post them in the comments. We will do our best to either reply there directly or, if it's warranted, make another video about it. So,
As of right now, it looks like our next video might be about pre-workouts, but if you guys want something else, yeah, shut up, Pedro. If you want something else, be sure to let us know.
all right. And without any further rambling, I think we're done.
Science.
Yes.